Hi guys, we are approaching the last few weeks of the semester. For the remaining 4 weeks, we're going to have this lecture, one lecture after this one, and then the next week is going to be your paper and review for the final, and then the fourth week will be finals week. Today we will be covering lecture 10, which covers chapter 12 in the book, and it is titled Production and Growth. The questions we want to ask ourselves are: how do economies grow? How did the United States develop from a small nation to the world's largest economy? What drives economic growth? And those are just some examples of some questions that we might be able to answer and some questions we want to look into. Every country's economy can grow, and generally it does grow throughout the years. Some grow at faster paces and some at slower paces. In 1870, the United Kingdom was richer than the United States, and today the United States is now richer. The GDP per capita of Germany used to be 50% of what the United Kingdom's was, and now it's like 10% higher. Mexico and Japan used to have relatively similar levels of GDP per capita, but Japan now is one of the best economies in the world, and is in fact 2 times Mexico's GDP per capita today. Countries, and this shows that countries are not doomed to having low standard of living throughout time. They can in fact increase, decrease, or outpace other countries. What determines a state or country's standard of living? The key determinants we are going to be looking at today is productivity. Productivity is going to drive economic development, and it's going to drive economic growth. We are going to look at and develop an idea of productivity. So to develop this idea of productivity, let's consider a single individual. What would a one-person economy look like? So this one individual, he's going to fish for food, he's going to grow vegetables, and he's going to make some clothing. What is this person's standard of living based on then? Well, if he fishes a lot and catches a lot of fish, grows lots of delicious vegetables, and makes really nice, fine clothing, then his standard of living is going to be good and he's going to live well. If he is bad at doing these things, he's going to live poorly. He only gets to consume what he produces, and his standard of living is tied to his productivity. His productivity being how productive he is and what he can produce. We'll define productivity as the quantity of goods and services produced from each unit of labor put into it. So productivity, the quantity of goods and services produced from each unit of labor put into it. We can see that this economy, their health is determined by his productivity, and this is going to be the same for countries. Japan enjoys a higher standard of living than Nigeria because Japanese workers are more productive than Nigerian workers. This is one of our 10 principles of macroeconomics we studied in the first lecture. And this is actually going to lead us into our next question. Well, if productivity determines our standard of living and certain countries are more productive than others, why would one country's productivity be higher than another? To answer this question, we need to look at how productivity is determined. In a single person economy, their productivity might be determined by how many fishing poles he has, whether or not he has a sewing machine, his knowledge of fishing, farming, and threading, his location as well, right? How many fish are in the nearby lake, ocean, or river, what kind of environment it is, and how rich the dirt is with nutrients. All of these will factor in to his productivity. He could also invent better lures, farming techniques, or clothes. Each one of these is going to be a determinant of his productivity. And each one of these is going to have a more complex component that fits into an economy that we are going to discuss. So in this example, we have physical capital. This is his fishing poles, or sewing machines, etc., or so on. Next one will be human capital. This is his knowledge of fishing, farming, and how good of a seamster he is. Knowledge of fishing, farming, making clothes. The natural resources, and that's going to be his environments, the riches of the lakes, dirt, air, so on. Uh, how many fish are in the ocean, quality of dirt. Oh, dirt. And lastly, technological knowledge. Technological knowledge. And this might be his development or his inventions. I mean, uh, development of lures or farming techniques. So all four of these will be a determinant in productivity. Let's go into each one of these. First, we're going to cover physical capital. Workers can produce more if they have more tools in which to work. The stock of equipment and structures used to produce goods and services is what we are going to call physical capital. Sometimes people will just call this capital. If you want to do that, be my guest. The second is human capital. This is an economist's terms for knowledge and skills of workers, including, but is not limited to, education, experiences, training, and any other skills taught while growing up or learning. This could be things that you're just on the street and you learn that, ants are attracted to dead animals or fruit that is left out. That would all be human capital. The third is going to be the number of natural resources per worker. Natural resources such as forests and oil, while some are renewable, like forests, others are not renewable, like oil, since it'll take millions of years to create oil once it's depleted. Forests are renewable because once you cut down a tree, you can replant it, and over time, the forest will regrow. While some countries' wealth is helped and supported by natural resources is not a necessity. America did well in part by a large supply of land that was good for agriculture, farming. Other countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are extremely rich because their land is over a large deposit of oil. So they just got lucky. Countries like Japan remain highly productive and is one of the richest countries in the world despite having few natural resources. International trade has made Japan success possible and easier, since they can import many of the natural resources they need. The last determinant of productivity is technological knowledge. Technological knowledge is an understanding on how to best produce goods and services. You can think of this as of how efficient the method of production is. Think about a farm. A long time ago, most Americans worked on farms because it took a lot of input from labor to feed the entire population. But thanks to technological advancements, now it takes a much smaller amount of the population to farm and frees up a lot of the labor to be productive in other areas of the economy. Now, you may think this sounds a lot like human capital, and it is very similar. Human capital, however, could just be that I know a way to make shirts. The shirt I make doesn't necessarily keep you warm, and it's not very comfortable. It itches a lot. However, another person with a higher technological knowledge makes a shirt that is soft to the touch, and no matter the temperature, keeps you warm. While we both had human capital on how to make a shirt, one person made the shirt better. This is one example. Another could be that I used 100 balls of yarn to produce my single shirt, and the other person with better technological knowledge produced it with only 20 balls of yarn. Again, their productivity is better than mine. It could also just be the speed. We both know how to make the exact same shirt, but the one who has a higher technological knowledge knows how to make it at a faster rate. A good way to distinguish between the two is that human capital is the labor force understanding of knowledge of the technology available. An example of this would be technological knowledge is the quality of the textbooks, and human capital is how long people have spent reading and understanding the textbooks. Some technology is common knowledge. After one person uses it, everyone becomes aware and can use it as well. Henry Ford's assembly line that he created is an example of this. After he created the assembly line, a bunch of other firms started using an assembly line as well. Other technology is proprietary. It is known only by the company that discovered it, such as Coca-Cola's secret recipe. No one knows the exact mixture that Coca-Cola uses to make their flavor of soda. Other technology may be proprietary for a short time, like with pharmaceutical companies. Once a pharmaceutical company discovers a new drug, they usually get a patent for their drug. The patent system gives a company the right to be exclusive manufacturer until the patent expires. This is to protect the amount of money that they put into research and development and allows them to recoup all the money that they spent in developing this drug. We are going to cover the production function, which is a mathematical representation of these ideas. So our production function is going to be our output, y, equal to a, which is going to be our technological knowledge, and then function of labor, the amount of labor in the economy, capital, this is physical capital, H is human capital, and N is going to be natural resources. A acts as generally an exponential effect, which is why it's outside of this. This is constant returns to scales, which means if I double L, K, H, and N, I'm going to double Y as well. But A is generally more of an exponential. So if I double A, I might 4 times Y, and things like that. If we divide this equation by L, we're going to find our output per worker, or in other words, our productivity. So we take Y, we divide by L, we're going to be equal to, again, A times the function. If I do L divided by L, that's just going to be 1. And then K divided by L, H divided by L, and N divided by L. So if this is output, this is going to be productivity. So our productivity is equal to our technology and our capital per worker or per laborer, our human capital per worker, and our natural resources per worker. What can government do to enhance productivity and living standards? Because economic growth is generally desired by a country, public policy can play a role. If we look at physical capital, we know that the stock of capital is a factor for productivity and a factor for production, which we just discussed on our equation right here. Physical capital being a input for output, and then our capital per worker being an input for productivity. If today we produce new capital goods, then tomorrow we will have a larger stock of capital and can produce even more goods and services. Thus, one way to raise productivity is to devote current resources to production of capital. As we can see, there's a trade-off between consumption today and investing for capital tomorrow. So there's a trade-off between consumption today and investing for capital tomorrow. And this is because when we save, we put our money into the bank sends out loans to firms, these firms use it for investing purposes, and they develop capital so that they can further produce goods and services. So there's a trade-off between our consumption and our savings. Our savings turns into investment, if we want to have higher investment rates, then we need to reduce our consumption. This is the trade-off that I was discussing. So let's suppose that a government pursues policies that raise the nation's savings rate over consumption. This savings allows for the development of new capital. The capital is not a free lunch, however. The more people save, the less they consume. Now, this isn't a permanent or static relationship. If we continually invest in capital, that doesn't mean we will see the same amount of growth each time we invest that amount. Even if we invest another percent of savings, so of our dollar that we make, if we invest another cent, that doesn't mean we're going to see our capital increase by the same amount. Capital is subject to what we call diminishing returns. As the stock of capital rises, the extra output produced from an additional capital falls. Think about it this way. You start with one worker and his productivity is 1. Then you give him a computer and his productivity increases to 2. Then you give him a second computer and maybe it increases his productivity by a bit more. But it will not increase his productivity by as much as the first computer. So maybe because he has 2 screens and while one computer is loading, he can work on the other one, his productivity rises to 2.5. So what happens if we keep giving this worker more and more computers? Each one has less use than the last. Each computer has diminishing marginal product of capital. So let's look at a graph explaining this relationship. On the y-axis, we'll have productivity. And on the x-axis, we will have capital. As we increase capital, our productivity increases. So it rises rapidly. But over time, we see diminishing returns. And we'll see a graph like this. At this point, increasing capital by 1 unit, right? If we go from here to here, our gain in productivity might be 0. Or it might be a very small amount. But our gain from capital in the short, like right here, when we have 0 to going to 1, we might see a huge increase in productivity. This graph demonstrates diminishing marginal returns. Now this has implications for poorer countries. If a country is poorer, it's going to have less capital. It's going to be closer to this side of the x-axis, which means it can grow more rapidly than a country that has this much capital, because it can experience this growth in productivity. An example of this would be the United States and South Korea. In 1960 to 1990, they devoted similar amounts of GDP to investment. Yet over this period, United States had a moderate growth of 2%, while South Korea experienced spectacular rates of 6%. A reason we see this might be the catch-up effect. The catch-up effect is this right here. This from like here to maybe like right here. As I described, a poor country is going to be here, and if they increase their savings rate, they'll experience rapid increases in productivity thanks to the increase in capital, where a country that is developed and has already a large stock of capital, increasing the savings rate won't help them as much, which allows the poorer country to catch up to the more developed nation. What are some other ways a economy can grow? Well, one way is investment from abroad. This type of investment is called FDI, or foreign direct investment. FDI. Foreign direct investment. When a country invests in a foreign country, they are engaging in FDI. This could be just a company such as Ford building a factory in, let's say, Mexico, or buying their currency, or another country buying another country's currency, or maybe buying into their stock market. Well, why do countries invest and build factories in other countries? Well, it's because they expect a return on their investment. The investment does not affect countries the same way as regular investment may. In the example with Ford, when they built the factory in Mexico, they raise Mexico's GDP by, let's say, 10, but their GNP is going to decrease by a lower amount. Now, we haven't talked about GNP, but GNP is gross national product. Gross national product means, or it's a measure, that if you took all of the income earned by that country's residents, whether their residents are in the domestic country or abroad. So if a Mexican citizen is living in China and produces $10,000, that would be included in GNP. The reason that FDI raises GDP by more than it raises GNP is going to be because the income that is returned to the home country of the factory or the investor. In the case with the Mexican citizen, right, the Mexican citizen is working in China and raising China's GDP by whatever amount of work he is producing, I guess. And he is returning some of the money back to Mexico, which is going to be the gross national product, which is going to be lower than the increase from GDP. However, the FDI still helps economies grow. It still helps the nation that receives the investment. And it really helps poor countries through other ways than just the foreign direct investment. It can help those countries learn state-of-the-art technologies from the developed or richer countries. If Ford builds a factory in Mexico, he will bring his best setup or technology to Mexico. Mexico can then learn it, copy it, and apply it to other aspects of their economy. For this reason, economic advisors of poorer countries typically suggest policies that encourage foreign investment. The World Bank is an organization that tries to encourage the flow of capital from rich countries to poor countries. Countries that participate within the World Bank will usually say, hey, we want to have some sort of investment, and then the World Bank will go out to rich countries and be like, there's an investment opportunity in this country. What do you think? And then they can try to direct capital to poor countries to help the poor countries start to develop, and then they pay back the richer countries. Now, let's talk about investment in education or human capital. It is generally at least as important as physical capital to invest in for long-run success. Investment in human capital often has the opportunity cost. You all know this because you all experience it, right? Instead of being here taking classes, you could be out working and earning a wage. Human capital also offers positive externalities. We'll talk about externalities. So externalities are when a private interaction has a third effect on a bystander. Why would human capital be a positive externality? Well, an educated person may generate new ideas And these new ideas are going to enter into society's pool of knowledge so that everyone can use them. Which means that if one person invests in human capital, he might benefit the people around him, which is the externality. Governments may value this externality and may put more of an emphasis in human capital than other ways to increase productivity, since there's this externality that improves societies or the people around the people who get human capital or education, training, etc. This could be a problem for poor countries. We call it the brain drain. And the brain drain is the emigration, which means they leave, of many of the highly educated workers from poor countries to rich countries. The reason they do this is because they're highly educated, they're very smart, they wouldn't enjoy a higher standard of living, so they move to a wealthier nation. United States is an example of this. We tend to have really good colleges for PhDs and masters and so on. So poor countries send students here and they study, and sometimes the student doesn't want to go back and they stay, and the poor country loses out because they had a really educated worker. So it kind of creates a dilemma for these poor countries. Should we send our workers to go get educated and then hopefully they come back, or should we just have them stay here and not be as productive as they could be? Next, we need to talk about health and nutrition. Human capital can also refer to the general health of a population. So if a government wants to increase expenditures and try to create a healthier population, that might be one way they can increase production. If we think about it, all things being equal, the healthier people are, the more they're going to be productive. They're not going to get as sick as often, they feel better throughout the day, and they'll work harder, whatever. This means that a government may want to target the health of a nation, and why obesity in America might be a problem in the future, or why malnutrition might be something that we want to focus on so that people aren't malnourished and can engage in labor activities and help the country develop. Another way for countries to increase productivity is through the country's institutions. Now, this is a really important one. Institutions. Now, these could be courts. They could be legislation. Legislation. It could be government agencies. And so on. Now, there are a ton of literature on institutions and their effects on economic growth. These institutions could be property rights, as well as courts, legislation, government agencies, and so on. Property rights is being a big one. The reason why courts are important is because they will ensure property rights are maintained and help people with disagreements, and so on. So having a good judicial system is an important institution. And as we discussed before, property rights are important because it's going to ensure the ability for people to trade within markets and ensure or maintain confidence so that people will produce goods and services. Now, if a country experiences turmoil, this could be an issue. Political instability will cause a lower amount of investment and less likelihood that the government can enact policy. So having political stability can help encourage growth, because if you have political instability, you're going to have a harder time enacting policies. Other countries aren't going to want to invest because they don't think they'll get a return. And businesses won't want to work there because they never know what's going to happen. The uncertainty caused by political instability is going to be a problem for economic growth. And it will even have a hard time enforcing things like property rights. If there's political instability, more than likely the government has like bigger things to worry about than if somebody steals something. Or maybe there's political instability because the government's corrupt and property rights aren't being maintained. It's also going to have a hard time minting money. Government that is facing, like Russia and the example of the rubles, even though they had money, it wasn't being used because people didn't have faith in the political stability of the Soviet Union at that time. So the literature surrounding these topics can even date back to colonialism. Through good political institutions, colonialism would implement institutions into the areas that they were going. So if Europe colonized part of Africa and instilled bad political institutions, those political institutions could still be in effect today and hurt the ability for countries to maintain their stability and hurt their ability to experience growth. Now, many poor countries have tried to achieve rapid economic growth by pursuing inward-oriented policies. These policies aim to increase productivity and standard of living by avoiding interaction with the rest of the world. But most economists today believe they should pursue outward-oriented policies, such as free trade. Japan is an extremely successful because they usually engage in trade. And we discussed how trade can make everyone better off, and this holds for countries as well as individuals. Research and development is yet another way to achieve economic development. By developing technology, it is one of the fastest ways for countries to have economic growth. As I said, with the production function, if we look back at it, I said that the technological knowledge was exponential in some cases. If it's exponential, that could be the highest rate of increase in output or productivity. So technology is really important. And research and development is one way to improve your technology. Now, most of the research comes from private firms or individual inventors, but government can support these efforts since there is a public interest in pursuing technological advancements. The last one I want to talk about is population growth. Population is yet another determinant of productivity. Remember, labor. Now, population size is an important factor in determining output, but at the same time, a higher population means there are more people to consume goods and services. This means a larger population does not necessarily mean a higher standard of living. If we increase the population and our output stays the same, right, our standard of living actually decreased because our productivity decreased, right? So if labor increases and Y doesn't, that means our productivity must have gone down, because if you divide a small number by a bigger number, it's going to be small. Population can also interact with other factors of production. So if you remember, we have labor, right? Labor is going to have an effect. Let me move this up. labor is going to affect natural resources. It's going to affect capital, and it's going to affect human capital, and this is going to be slash technological knowledge. Let's first go over natural resources. So, there was an economist in the late 1700s, early 1800s called Thomas Robert Malthus. I'll move this back actually. Thomas Robert Malthus. Now, Thomas Robert Malthus was a poor individual. He grew up poor, and he was relatively successful as an economist, and he had a very important paper that he published and that a lot of people really took to and kind of bought into and agreed with. He hung out with other famous economists such as David Ricardo. However, Malthus, his most prominent book focused on population. He argued that population would outgrow the natural resources of the planet and that poverty would always exist. He believed that misery and vice were the mechanisms to keep population in check, and argued that government policies to prevent poverty or charities' use to alleviate poverty were counterproductive because it allowed them to have more children or enabled them to have more children, placing an even greater strain on society's productive capabilities. Which basically meant he said that poverty was natural and that we should just let it happen because that we didn't want population to get out of control, and if it did, it would be widespread poverty. He believed there was like a cutoff point, and once you hit that, everything is going to go down and people will experience bad times. A lot of people kind of liked these ideas at the time. David Ricardo did not. They were friends and they often argued about these topics. David Ricardo, being a rich economist, believed that the poor should be helped and supported. So even though Malthus was poor, he kind of didn't like the poor, and even though David Ricardo was rich, he liked the poor. His prediction was that through unchecked population, because humans have a desire for sexual partnership, that our farming and our resources would not allow for this unchecked growth, because our growth would be exponential and our farming would be arithmetic. Let's draw this. So we'll have a graph. And then we'll have, I guess, what would be on the x-axis? Time. And then this would be like number of people and number of food. So he thought food grew at a pace like this. It took a lot of labor. It was really hard. So you would have to increase the amount of land by 2, and the amount of labor by 2, and you would double your amount. So if this was 2, this was 2, then over here would be 4 and 4. And then you would fit on the line. While he thought population was exponentially. It grew exponentially. Because 2 people have 4 kids, 4 kids have 8 kids, 8 kids have 16 kids, so on, so forth. So he felt that population grew like this. At first it was slow, and then developed rapidly. Something like that. And then this would be the cutoff point. Anything beyond this, right, and there wouldn't be enough food for the people. And we would have extreme poverty and misery at those points. And that we should strive to be somewhere along here. So he was a big advocate for like population control and policies that did not help the poor, because that was nature's way of preventing us from getting here. Our productivity was tied to capital. So I'll bring this back. Productivity is tied to capital. This is a production function, which is also a function of capital. If the population increases, so if L increases, our capital per worker decreases, which means that each worker is now less productive, because if L increases, right, and capital doesn't, our Y will be the same, and then we'll have a smaller productivity. The last way is that population may affect technological growth. This one is based off of kind of our human capital and technological knowledge. So our natural resources was that eventually labor would increase to a point where natural resources could no longer support or sustain our population, even though that our technological advances ended up outpacing our population. And from the time of Malthus, our population as a world has, I think, 6-fold or more. It has exponentially grown, but we have not yet seen a point where natural resources hasn't been able to sustain us. Our capital is that when labor increases and capital remains the same, our capital per worker decreases, making each worker slightly less productive. Let's think about this. If we have 5 workers on a farm, each worker has a shovel to dig and then plant the seeds. We hire, all of a sudden labor increases, right? The population increases. Now I have 8 workers, but I still only have 5 shovels. The average productivity for each of those workers is now lower. And lastly, we are going to have human capital technological knowledge. Well, this is simple because as labor increases, there's more people. The more people there are, there's going to be more scientists, more inventors, more engineers, more economists, and so on. And this is going to lead to increases in technological advancements. That's going to benefit everyone. So what Malthus didn't account for is that when labor increases, this increases, and as long as this increases at a faster rate and our farming and things get much better, we can actually have farming that might be more in line with this, and we'll always have more food than people. Now, theoretically, if our population gets so out of control and we have no space to like move around because there's just so many people, and at that point, yeah, Malthus is probably right, and we would end up being in this area of poverty and misery. So we kind of determined how population plays a role in the other factors of productivity and production. We kind of talked about how the factors of production affect output, and then we talked about how FDI, institutions, externalities, the catch-up effect, trade-offs between consumption, how all these things can or are tied into economic growth and development. Well, let's look at Africa, which is one of the least developed continents, and in some of their countries they suffer extreme poverty. And we want to ask ourselves, why is Africa so poor and has a low level of economic development? Now, one reason will be a low capital investment, low educational attainment, poor health, high population growth, certain geographic disadvantages such as being landlocked. Landlocked is mean within your country there you have no access to the sea or to the ocean. A lot of countries in Africa have restricted freedom, rampant corruption. In Africa, nations tend to be very corrupt. With the the 14 most corrupt country, over half are in Africa, and Somalia was the most corrupt in 2018, according to our indices that we calculate. And this corruption hinders savings and investment. People don't want to invest in countries that are very corrupt because they don't know what's going to happen. Yeah, they allow me to build a factory one day, but the next day maybe they say I have to pay another fine to keep my factory. So I pay that fine, and the next day they come back and they're like, hey, you hadn't paid this fine. And I'm like, wait, no, I did pay it, but because they're corrupt, they're going to force me to pay another one. And people don't want to save in corrupt countries because if I start saving, I don't know what's going to happen to my money. The last reason Africa might be poor is the legacy of colonization. I kind of already briefly touched on this. When these areas were colonized, the colonizers put in place poor institutions, making it hard for the place to experience prosperity, even after the colonizers had left. Most of these institutions stayed because when the colonizers left, someone took power, and the person in power tended to like these bad institutions because it granted them more power over the region. While none of these suggest an easy solution to fix the problem in Africa, that does not mean the area is doomed. Through good policy and, with maybe a bit of luck, these areas can do well. Botswana is a pretty good example of this. They do have their issues. They have like an HIV problem and some other social issues, but their income is about at the world average. So they're doing all right. And this country does much better than most of its neighbors, experiencing higher investment, better education, lower population growth, higher vaccination rates, and lower malnutrition rates. So although they may not be doing terrific, they're doing much better than their peers, and through these higher investment, better education, lower population growth, they will achieve higher growth rates, and assumingly, eventually, they'll be, if the catch-up effect is working and is working as advertised, then they'll be just as developed as any other country. In conclusion, government can assist with economic growth and enact policies that help support and increase the health of the determinants of economic development, such as productivity, labor, natural resources, human capital, physical capital, and technological knowledge. The other important thing is population, which helps our output and affects our productivity. It can also affect our other determinants of productivity, such as our natural resources, our physical capital, our human capital, and our technological knowledge. That covers lecture 10. Next week will be lecture 11. And then after that, we have our paper that's going to be due that week. Make sure you're coming up with ideas and topics for that. If you have questions, please ask me. And then after that, we'll have our final.